Welcome. Welcome to you all. My name is Bruce Caldwell. It's a pleasure to welcome you to another Hayek Lecture Series event. The Hayek Lecture Series is sponsored by three campus groups. The Center for the History of Political Economy, I'm the director of that. The Duke UNC PPE program, and we have the various directors of that in the audience today, and the Duke program in American Values and Institutions. And the outside funder is the Thomas W. Smith Foundation that provides the funds for this lecture series. Peter Boettke is our speaker today, and he has a plane that I have to get him to. There are going to be books available for signing. This book, Living Economics, directly afterwards if anyone wants to purchase it, but I will just let you know in advance that he has to be rushed off very quickly. So if you want to do that, it will have to be a quick jobbing. A little bit about Pete. Dr. Boettke is a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, and the director of the F.A. Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus Center of GMU. Peter Boettke received a BA in economics from Grove City College and his MA and PhD in economics from George Mason University. Before joining the faculty at George Mason, he taught at New York University. In addition, he's been a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and the F.A. Hayek Fellow 2 times at the London School of Economics. He's the editor of the journal Review of Austrian Economics and directs the weekly PPE workshop at GMU. This has been an institution at GMU for more than a decade, certainly a couple of decades, and it's just a wonderful workshop series. Professor Boettke is the author of numerous journal articles and books. Among the latter, I'll mention just 3: Living Economics, the one that's available, in which he defends basic economic reasoning; Institutional Analysis and Development, which examines the work of Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom; and his early book on the Soviet Union, When Perestroika Failed, The Economics and Politics of Socialist Transformation. The title of Pete's talk today is Taming Leviathan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pete Boettke.
Do I have to tie this in at all? Nope, just talk?
Just talk.
Thank you very much for that. I saw here Jeff Brennan here, and for those of you who are here, you would probably much rather hear him give this talk than me, since this is going to build a lot on work that he has done before. So I apologize in advance for screwing up your ideas in some sense. But what I'm trying to do here is I want to first sort of get you to think about a puzzle, that Leviathan creates a puzzle for us, and recognizing that as a puzzle is a normative position at some level. But then I want to suggest that the analytics of trying to fix that puzzle is completely positive. There's sort of positive analysis in this. And a lot of this finds its roots in here from a very simple point that Jim Buchanan wanted to stress in his work, which was that when you engage in any theory of public economics, you implicitly have a political philosophy that underlies it, because you're dealing with questions about the nature of the scope and scale of government. That is a kind of a normative political theory position, but how you then choose to sort of think about solutions to that problem, if you so design it that way, then that is an analytical argument that requires that you find incentive compatible schemes, right? And that we can all agree on that. So if we disagree about the puzzle to begin with, we can still sort of, if you, for sake of argument, grant me that puzzle, then we can analyze whether or not my solutions are fit with this incentive compatibility idea. The other idea, which is very much a Buchanan project in this, has to deal with the fact that the basic sort of way to think through that system of thought is same players, different rules produce different games. Right, so what we want to analyze, we're methodological individualists in the sense that we're sort of, trying to find our explanations back from the point of view of the acting or animating agent, but that the focus of our attention is going to be on the institutional environment within which those agents interact. And so if we see a problem, I'm going to suggest that institutional problems demand institutional solutions. It's not about putting different people in power or anything like that. It's about changing the institutional environment. So let's see here. So everyone know where this comes from? All right, it's the front piece of Hobbes' Leviathan. This creates our puzzle, right? How is it that we can constrain Leviathan or tame Leviathan is the question that I'm asking. Some people, by the way, don't think that that's even a question. Nowadays, I actually think one of the more challenging books for people like Mike and myself and others that are trying to tackle some of these questions is by a woman named Helena Landemore, and it's on democratic reason. And in some sense, though, again, she could maybe accuse me of not passing the appropriate Daniel Dennett argument test, but I think it's right. It's just she's resurrecting, in some sense, the kind of Rousseauian general will, and that the democratic process itself, through the miracle of aggregation, gives us, this sort of social will kind of idea. And if that was the case, if the social will could be, that would be a different puzzle than the puzzle of trying to think about Leviathan. All right, so in my argument, which is pretty much US-centric, it's focusing on the idea of that we had this sort of approach to constraining Leviathan, that approach broke down in the 20th century. Now the question is, how do you get those constraints to somehow rebuild again? And this book by Michael Grieva, sort of two books are kind of animating factors in this book, in this article. One of them is Michael Grieva's book. The other one is Richard Epstein's book. So Grieva's book's The Upside Down Constitution. The book by Epstein's called The Classical Liberal Constitution, which is his effort to then constrain the state again in the world that we live in. And I'm sort of trying to suggest that there's another way to look through these kind of ideas. But if you think about this upside down constitution idea, what Grieva points out is that building on the progressives, what happened was they started to develop intergovernmental schemes in financing, so that basically the Tibu type competition is muted. And in fact, what happens is you get cartel federalism rather than competitive federalism. And when that happens, Leviathan grows unconstrained. All right, that's sort of see that institutional transformation, and in particular, the way in which our programs are funded through taxes. And so this goes back again to, Jeff's work, which is really asking the question, let's say, in the power to tax, and in some alternative version, maybe the way that you would also think about the reason of rules but applied to the power to tax, right? Is the idea here is that if we think about the fiscal relationship as being one where you must tie the spending decision and the tax decision close to one another rather than separated from one another. So the analogy that Buchanan used to use in class all the time is a dinner club. And if we went to the dinner, we all joined a dinner club and we agreed that we would equally split the bill, then the question you have to ask yourself is, on the margin, what's the marginal cost to you of an extra cannoli or another glass of wine or an appetizer in the beginning? And so what happens is you, by the rules that were set up, you divorce the spending and the tax decision, and as a result you get a fiscal commons. And with a fiscal commons you get overgrazing, which leads to the issue here. So how do we normally check that? We check that with competition, right? And we think about Tibu model competition as a thing that, because people are able to vote with their feet, so if you don't like the current array of public goods and services for the tax bill that you pay, you pick up, move to the town next. And that disciplines the current town for making sure that you're that. Well, what happens when that check is stopped? And you can think about that at the local level, at the state level, because of the shift of moving towards intergovernmental schemes in which you no longer have this tight relationship. and therefore the forces of Tibu competition are muted. So the argument, and this, by the way, I should point out, this is part of a book project which will eventually emerge. I gave a talk earlier today, which is on the comparative political economy of crises, which is sort of the beginning of the book project. This chapter eventually will be the end of the book chapter. This is work with my colleague Leah Palagashvili, and it's a book project called Against Triage Economics, Misadventures in Economic Emergency Rooms. And we're sort of looking at the way in which public policy is transformed because of the institutional environment within which it takes place, combined with the emotional rhetoric of emergencies and how that produces policies which we argue are not conducive to long-run economic vitality. But this particular chapter is about the idea of how you can constrain the growth of government precisely in order to keep it bound within the guidelines that we see as consistent with creating the framework for an economically liberal regime, which we believe has moved away. So this is how the argument goes in the paper. There was an old-time fiscal religion, what Jim Buchanan calls vulgar public economics, that used to exist before the new Keynesian economics. And that old-time fiscal religion existed from Adam Smith and the Founding Fathers basically until the Great Depression. Old-time fiscal religion was very simple. Sort of basically, the basic idea was that you could have times of crises in which you would then move away from fiscally prudent sort of general rules in order to meet emergency circumstances, but that as soon as those circumstances were over, crisis due to war or depression, you would then balance your budget over time. So imagine a kind of an idea where you have a business cycle, and during times of recession you would run deficits, but during times of plenty you would run surpluses, and over the life of the business cycle you would have a balanced budget or a relationship on that. And what happened was in the wake of the Great Depression, the governing ideology among economists, meaning the way they thought about these public policy issues, was that argument sort of lost its focus, and instead we moved in a different direction. So that's first part. There was this old-time fiscal religion. It had to have existed to be overturned. Okay, I had this debate once, by the way, with Phil Morawski, who denied that there was ever that the Keynesian revolution actually wasn't like a Keynesian revolution, right? And then I said, well, but there was a monetarist counter-revolution that you're talking about, right? And he's like, yes. And I said, well, in order for something to be a counter-revolution, there had to be a revolution first, right? I don't know, I don't see it that way. Well, so I want to sort of make this argument that there was this sort of practice. And we can, in fact, see this in the data, I would suggest, if you look at the way in which the budget is accounted for in the U.S. for, say, the first 150 years of its existence versus the last 70 years or so. All right, so progressive era ideology and the transformation first of the idea of public administration, and then the science of economics as a tool to fit the new idea of public administration. This is another subsidiary part of the argument in the paper, which is that the progressive era was not neutral with respect to economics. It actually led to a transformation. But the argument is that it leads to a transformation through transforming the discipline of public administration, what we consider to be tolerable in our state of affairs changes. And when that changes, the discipline that provides the information for that must change to meet that new desire as well. So progressive era ideology transforms public administration, which then in turn transforms the science of economics, which means that it's going to be not sympathetic to the old-time fiscal religion. The old constraints on the scale and scope of government no longer binding, nor even viewed as justified. So it's pushing open a screen door as opposed to a locked steel door, because now we've actually weakened the argument that the vulgar economics actually made sense. You're now pushing open a screen door. The screen door opens. Post-World War II changes in the nature of politics and economics in the Western democratic states. This is an empirical claim, is not sustainable. We can debate about that if you want, and that as an institutional problem thus requires institutional solution. So in the end, what I'm trying to look at is I'm going to try to sort of address the question of whether or not we can find an institutional fix for what I consider fiscal irresponsibility and monetary mischief, if you use those phrases. So where does this come from? It actually comes from Adam Smith. These are quotes from Adam Smith's the fifth book of The Wealth of Nations, chapter 3 on public debts. Smith describes the nature of the interaction between governments and the economy as one of juggling tricks. So the natural proclivity of governments is to run deficits, accumulate public debts, and then debase currencies. And Smith argues this is what governments have done, ancient as well as modern. So the secret is to do what? To stop the juggling, not to embrace the juggling. That's a Smithian sort of answer here. And as this quote goes through and explains, he says that this idea of debasing the currency is a pretend payment, that instead that this is we engage in this juggling trick, and so the question is, can we actually curtail the juggling? So keep that image in your head. If you want to stop someone from juggling, you can do one of two things. You can take the objects of their juggling out of their hands. Then they're just flailing. They're not juggling, right? They're just moving their hands, but they're not juggling anything. Or you tie their hands behind their back, in which the objects that they're juggling fall to the ground and they don't control it. But that's it. One of two things, okay? Tie their hands or take the objects out. For most of the 20th century, economists of the ilk that I come out of have figured out ways or thought to figure out ways to try to tie the ruler's hands so that they don't engage in the juggling. The problem is that a government that is strong enough to tie its own hands is strong enough to break the bonds of those ties anytime at once. And as a result, juggling continues to go on. So, in the end, what I'm going to try to argue for is institutional solutions which take the juggling out, the objects of the juggling out of their hands. And that's going to be the most problematic, but maybe also interesting conversation for your students, because from what I understand, you guys have been wrestling with this issue of constraining Leviathan, or thinking about that problem, or the idea that, I have to empower but then constrain the government. And what I need to do then is figure out where that line is drawn and how do I constrain that. You think about one way to do it, the nexus of voluntary exchanges is a giant circle. That's rule 1 that we learn in Econ 101. All exchange is mutually beneficial. That's the nexus of voluntary exchanges. What's the next line that we learn? We have to cut off a certain amount of those exchanges to finance what? The protection of private property rights, right? And so that gives us somewhere where the economic role of the state. So the question is, once we have the economic role of the state, what keeps it at, say, the protection of private property or whatnot? And that leads me to the puzzle in our paper that we're trying to explore, which is the political puzzle of the political economy of a good society. What institutional framework empowers yet constrains? So, again, to invoke Jim Buchanan, this paper and the whole book project actually, the easiest way to understand the book project is, imagine a world in which Hayek's understanding of money and monetary mischief and Buchanan's understanding of fiscal irresponsibility and institutional fixes to that irresponsibility dominated our intellectual culture, rather than the Larry Summers, Stan Fisher, kind of macro management kind of approach to the way that we do public policy. So just envision if that world was the case. What would have we done in the face of the 2008 crisis? And how different would have that been? All right, that's an easy way to For those of you who are into the economics of this, that's an easy way to see that. So this puzzle is as follows. We have a political economy. Let's go back and just so remember this image, right? So here I have Leviathan. All right, come on, go back. It's not, there we go. So there's Leviathan. All right, now the question is that we have this, we don't want to go in the direction of having no government, but on the other hand, we don't want to go in the direction of maximal government. How do we steer this line in between these two, and how do we draw that, and then draw the kind of idea here? And so the puzzle is we have to empower the protective state. That gives us law, order. We have to empower the productive state. That gives us public goods and various different services. But we want to constrain the predatory state. So Madison's puzzle was what? If men were angels, there'd be no need for government. If government be run by angels, there'd be no need for constraints. But precisely because men are going to rule over other men, we have to first empower and then constrain. All right? That's the taming the Leviathan point. All right? So we're going to sort of figure out a way to do this, yet constrain the predatory state. It's my empirical conjecture that the 20th century is one in which we were unable to constrain the predatory state, and that the predatory state was in fact unleashed. And this is seen in the rise of sort of rent-seeking and whatnot. It's not in the paper, but as I gave an example at lunch, my lunch talk today, when I went to graduate school at George Mason, Washington, D.C. was actually a fairly sleepy town compared to New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles. All right. When I used to teach in New York and come down to D.C., I always used to make a joke about the difference between behavior on the subway versus behavior on the metro system. Because in the metro system, they're very genteel and calm and everything because no one was making any money. Time wasn't money. In New York, you know, you needed to get on the subway. People would push you out of the way and they jump in. It has nothing to do with being a New Yorker or being a person from D.C. or Southern, values or whatever. But, time was money. So here's something interesting. 8 of the 10 richest counties in the United States today are now outside of Washington, D.C. That's a transformation of that whole culture in that area. And it's not because they came up with wealth-creating ideas. It's because we've unleashed the predatory state. And Milton Friedman, how many here remember Milton Friedman's Free to Choose videos? You remember Milton Friedman in a helicopter going over Washington, D.C. and pointing at Bethesda and talking about the ineffectiveness of what was going on with the state, right? Because for every $3 that came in, it's an old Gordon Tullock line as well, for every $3 that came in, $2 went to the administration of the policy. So you have $3 for poverty relief, but only $1 goes to the recipients, $2 go to those who administer the system. And those people, and so Friedman pointed out that, well, that's actually what we've witnessed over the last 20 years in Washington, D.C. In the wake of 9/11 and then in the wake of the financial crisis, it's been very good for that area of the country. We didn't have a housing crisis or anything like that. So this is this unleashing of that. So what I try to do in the paper, or what we try to do in the paper, is we provide some evidence of this expansion of Leviathan. And so this is government spending as a percentage of GDP. Taken from the OECD countries. And as you can see in here, in 1870, for example, all government spending, that's all government spending, not just federal spending, but all government spending was around 10%. And then by 2013, you're at 46%. And, you can also see in this, if you slice it like the way Higgs would slice it, Bob Higgs, Crisis and Leviathan, and you take war years or crisis years, what you'll see is that there's an expansion of government and then a retrenchment, but never a retrenchment back to the earlier point. So what you do is get this growth of government in this stepwise fashion. We did have a tremendous decline in the role of government and after World War II, right? Government spending as a percentage of GDP was 60% or more at the end of World War II, but then it came back down. But it never comes back down to the pre-war levels. All right. This is a way to look at this pictorial. It doesn't really tell you much. This is a terrible PowerPoint presentation, so forget that. It's just the same graph just shown on these. This is the issue of the Federal Registry. Again, Milton Friedman made this famous by counting up the shelves of the Federal Registry of Regulations by showing how federal regulations have expanded in the 20th century. And this sort of just documents those number of pages. For those of you who are students, one of my colleagues at the Mercatus Center, Pat McLaughlin, who is a Clemson PhD, he just did a recent one where he piles up the registry and shows you the actual physical amounts of them, and it's a cool like little YouTube video, good for teaching and good for showing students about the rise of the regulatory state. And so these are the numbers, as you can see here. 2013 we have 80,000 pages, whereas in 1936 we had 2,000 pages. Now you could, of course, have an alternative interpretation of this, which is that the economy has gotten more complex. More complex economies need more regulatory oversight or whatnot. And so we could have that debate. Again, that's a sort of a separate issue from exactly my paper, which takes as given that we have this problem of taming Leviathan and then wants to address analytically how we go about doing that, as opposed to debating over whether or not we have a problem with Leviathan. That would be a separate paper. So this is where I'm kind of getting at. Jeff, I think will remember this. So in Buchanan's class, he often asked very telling questions. He's a great teacher in this sense, in that he would ask questions. For those of you studying public choice, I always describe the difference between Buchanan and Tulloch as follows, is that Buchanan, in some sense, always ended class with a question that he didn't know the answer for, or at least he pretended that he didn't know the answer for. And so in that sense, he was always asking you to think of new questions. And when you'd say, Mr. Buchanan, I don't quite understand, where's this going to go? He says, if I knew the answer, I wouldn't ask the question. That kind of thing. Gordon Tulloch never asked a question that he didn't know an answer to. So he was ready to jujitsu you, because he didn't like your answer. So he'd say, Mike, why is it that in Sweden they have such a generous welfare state, but they still have, homeless people? And then, Mike would puzzle through a question or whatever, and Tulloch would sort of make fun of you as dismissive and then walk out of the room. Because he had his own, paper. And so there's a difference in that model. So Buchanan, one of my first questions he asked me as a student was, who is the individual in economics? It's a great question, actually. Who are we thinking about, all this stuff. And, if you read a piece by Buchanan on natural and artifactual man, or if you read Frank Knight, his teacher, you learn all kinds of different types of men populate economic models. Like the sportsman, the sort of not just the narrow self-interested individual, but aspirational man, the idea that I want to be better than what I currently am, and what does that mean for me to try to strive to do that? And Buchanan asked that question. It was a very stimulating question, I think, for a graduate student in economics. But here's the other one, which is a very practical one. He asks, it is said that a fly that grew 9 times its size could no longer fly. What does that say about fiscal dimensionality? All right, now, the idea here is that you have a fly, and it's architecturally designed to fly when it's small like this, but as you scale it, by the way, this is just a perfect scaling by a person who is very weak at technological ideas. Mainly, I took a picture from Google of a fly, I put it on the PowerPoint, then I moved it to another place, and then I just scaled it up, right? Just blew up the place for it. So it's perfectly scalable here. But Buchanan's asking the question, is fiscal dimensionality scalable like that? And it turns out that in the actual physics of the fly, that a fly this size, that those wings would break under its weight. So that it's not a scalable thing. So that's what he means by it. And it was because he read this book, at least during my time, it was called The Physics and the Dancing Woolly Masters or something like that. And he was really into it. And so he was asking us to think about these things. And so this is the question. So you grow this fly, but it can no longer function. And then what does that say about the scale and scope of government? So if you think in terms of the kind of argument that I'm giving here, you would say something as follows, that government should be restricted to those activities that it can do well and only those activities it can do well. Right? That's not that controversial of a statement, actually. Government should only do those things it can do well and be restricted to only those things it can do well. We don't want government doing things that it can't do well. We don't want government to be trying to fly, but yet it can't fly. And yet fiscal dimensionality might raise that question. So this is what Epstein argues is the state that we're in. So if you take the Michael Greva point and you flip the Constitution upside down so you lose all the checks against the growth of the government because you no longer have the competitive forces of federalism to discipline government, but instead now government has become a cartel federalism, which basically treats the fiscal or the budget as a common, so it blows up. What then happens, and as Epstein argues at the end of his classical liberal constitution, that the predatory state or the rent-seeking state is that you have this massive expansion of transfer payments off an ever-decreasing productive base. That's the unsustainability point, right? Is that you have an increasing demand for those resources, but an increasing ability to produce the resources that are demanded of it. That means it's unsustainable. So then, what should we do? So this is where the paper sort of turns to. In many ways, in the current draft of the paper, this is both the punchline and also the weakest punch. It's kind of like a whimper punch at the end. It's like I sort of believe that I'm setting you up for a big left hook, and then I kind of like hit you with a cotton ball. But it's improving, meaning it's an ongoing research project, which we're trying to get at. And here's the sort of idea. You know, you have this choice, again, as I said before. Let me step back for 1 second and just talk about modern economics, and then I'll come back to this. So if you think about the difference between Buchanan and Hayek and the Keynesian and then neoclassical synthesis, the reason why Buchanan especially has to sort of defend what he called the vulgar economics of fiscal policy was because in the new economics, rather than viewing the juggling as an unfortunate behavior pattern that governments engage in, the juggling is you're now trained to be a master juggler. That's what you're taught. Okay? So rather than the idea that juggling is not something you should engage in, it's not prudent, you are now trained to be master jugglers. Now the question is whether or not the master jugglers are all that good at juggling. That's where the sort of empirical claims matter. Because if they're not very good at juggling, what you get is exactly the Epstein point, that you have this sort of rent-seeking state that's not sustainable. But that wasn't anyone's desire when they started to do that. All right, so if you grant me that, and then we come back to this issue about, okay, so the juggling is bad, not to be embraced. Right? So flippantly, I have a $100 reward out for any graduate student or undergraduate student. It's undergraduates mainly, not graduate students, that will draw me a good caricature of Ben Bernanke in a helicopter dumping cash and then sucking up the excess reserves with a vacuum cleaner at exactly the right rate. Because that's actually sort of what they believe that they could do. Now, nothing in Bernanke's argument is illogical. Nothing in Bernanke's argument is malevolent. Bernanke did in 2008 and subsequently exactly what you would have predicted if you read his 1983 paper on the credit transmission mechanism. He's a very theory-consistent actor. There's no real great divorce there. But the argument is in fact that they can, in fact, increase the liquidity in the economy and also suck up the excess reserves so that you don't have the problem of inflation at exactly the right amount. That is a master juggler, right? Same thing with the expenditures, government expenditures on the fiscal side. So the juggling is what's embraced. The question is, what if we wanted to do a rule of law approach to macroeconomics in which you bound the authorities right? So that they wouldn't have that kind of discretion to engage in that kind of juggling. Milton Friedman in Capitalism and Freedom, page 50, has a great argument about the issue with the Fed. And he says the following thing. Any institution where a sincere error by a few can threaten the existence of the entire economy is a system we cannot afford. That's Friedman's argument against an independent central bank. All right, 1962. It's an argument about robustness in institutions, right? That we want to make sure that we bind the authorities. It's an argument that Jeff and Jim use a lot in their Reason of Rules, which is the argument that comes out of Hume, right? When designing a government, we must presume that all men are knaves. Knavery comes in two forms. It comes in the form of arrogance, and it comes in the form of opportunism. It doesn't just come in one form, it can come in both of those forms. And Adam Smith chides both sort of forms of knavery in that. Hume lays that idea in designing a government. It's not a descriptive argument that all men are in fact knaves, but instead that you want to build institutional environments that can sustain itself against knavery. That's the question. Why? Because we can't trust that they'll always do the juggling correctly. For what reasons? One, they might not have the cognitive capacity to pull that off, or they might not have the incentive compatibility to pull it off. So what institutional solutions? So we can start from a very, very sort of agreed upon argument in economics, which is that we need to have rules rather than discretion in monetary policy, and we need to have competition rather than in fiscal affairs. And so Barry Weingast, in his ideas on market-preserving federalism and the various conditions under which he believes must be held in order for market-preserving federalism to hold, gives you a sort of an outline of how it is that you could have effective TBU competition in this, what he calls market-preserving federalism. So you could imagine a world where we could bind the rulers in their monetary policy by, say, a Friedman rule. And then you could also bind the fiscal policy through competition. And that competition would bring in line spending and tax decision closer. Monetary policy and that. What's wrong with that picture? The problem with that picture is that it actually hasn't been able to be effective. So if you think about someone like Milton Friedman, over the long history of his career, he became increasingly radicalized with respect to his belief about whether or not the Fed could follow a monetary rule. Or if you look at F.A. Hayek, who starts out very much like Friedman in a rule-bound system of money, then he wants to have some kind of what we would now call NGDP targeting kind of idea, and then eventually he moves to what? Denationalization of money. Not because he wants to sort of turn money over to the market, but it's precisely because he believes that there's no alternative to check the juggling of the government unless we take this ball out of their hands. And so that kind of moves in that way. But the first idea is we got to go through all the arguments about the effort to bind the juggler's hands and how effective they are, and then work through. So what we argue at the end of the paper is that the binding hasn't been effective at solving the puzzle. And so therefore we might have to think more boldly and creatively about this, which is to take the objects the jugglers juggle out of their hands. Now, let me just step back real quick and give you one other recent example of an area where fiscal policy and monetary policy create this disjoint and then the problem, and that's the Argentinian crisis. Okay, at the turn of this, I get confused about this, but the turn of this century or whatever, right? So if you remember, what Argentina did was they signed on to a currency board, which meant that they exported their monetary policy outside of their country. And it was pegged against the dollar, okay? And so they don't have control, right, of their monetary policy, though. So they can't monetize their debts. That's out of their hands. So now, what the problem was is that the regional governors in Argentina were not at all facing any fiscal discipline. So they did the ordinary politics thing, which is they promised more than they could deliver, which meant that they were increasing public debt, in debt. So then there was a pressure. They have to fess up to their public bankruptcy, or they have to break the currency board. Right? So what did they do? They broke the currency board, led to a crisis, economic crisis in Argentina. Precisely because the fiscal policies were undisciplined, even though the monetary policy was disciplined, but the political authorities then broke the discipline on the monetary policy. Now, transfer to Greece. What's going on in Greece? It's the same kind of thing. In the old days, what would have happened is Greece would have monetized its debts, right? And then would have suffered all those consequences that are associated with it. But now what we have is the European Union. Greece has this problem. It can't monetize its own debts. Okay? So what does it have to do? It has to engage in political negotiations and bailouts from the European Central Bank. Right? Which then puts pressure on what? The European Central Bank to then monetize its problems down the road. So we have an institutional problem. We're trying to sort of think through that. And that's true in Greece and Argentina, but it's also true in California, Illinois, New York, and whatnot in the United States. So the question is how do we sort of address this issue? And what we want to sort of take is sort of Hayek's lead on this, and then think in terms of the abolishing the state monopoly in currency supply, and how that would be an effective check on the government's ability to monetize its affairs. But precisely because of the issues that we have in Argentina, thinking through those, we want to make sure that we think about enhancing competition in the fiscal affairs. And in this regard, I think we need to move beyond Weingast's 5 conditions and instead embrace a little bit more of what Bruno Frey refers to as the functioning, overlapping, competing jurisdictions. Now, Frey has a great essay on his approach, which is called Utopia ? Right? Because at some level, what I'm talking about seems utopian, right? Competing money supplies, sort of getting rid of the geographic monopoly on coercion, instead having these kind of overlapping competing jurisdictions, which is treating governments more like clubs and having them compete with one another for their tax base. But the reality is that we also see enough of some of this stuff emerging naturally that, right? So we have competing currencies emerging right in front of your eyes, which are cryptocurrencies. We have competing overlapping jurisdictions, which are called private neighborhood associations. One of the things that's grown massively in the United States over the last 25 years is the rise of private neighborhood associations, precisely to provide the share of public goods that they don't feel that the state actually is providing for them, which includes security, roads, other amenities that they consider to be these public goods. So utopia is a question mark in that sense, just like Frey argued. So if what you can do is imagine this kind of system in which you could have this sort of, the government has no control over the money supply. And by the way, let me just step back for a second. They just came out with a new book, which is a new update of the In Search of a Monetary Constitution. So back in when the Thomas Jefferson Center at the University of Virginia, when Buchanan and Warren Nutter started that, in 1962 is kind of a watershed year for that group. All right, because on the one hand, they have the calculus of consent, but on the other hand, G. Warren Nutter also published his famous NBER book on the extent of economic development in the Soviet Union, right, which was challenging the sort of standard versions of that. But Leland Yeager at the same time published a book called In Search of the Monetary Constitution, and they've now reissued a new version of it. In that, of course, in the most recent version, Buchanan, at the end of his career here, and he had a long career because he never stopped. I saw him 4 months before he passed away give an early version of the talk that comes out in here, and he walked away and he said, well, I can't imitate him as well as I'd like to, but he says, well, I'm not that happy with this draft. I have to do another rewrite of that draft. And he was 93 years old. I remember thinking to myself, there's a role model. As he walked out of the room, it was like, that's how you want to do things. So he constantly was doing that. But he was talking about the constitutionalization of money, trying to take money outside of its ability to actually respond in discretion at all. And how do you constitutionalize money in this regard? Again, sort of an evolution of his effort at frustration in the intellectual arguments for this. So the idea here is that these ideas seem crazy. We're also dealing with a lot of them emerging right in front of us, and they may in fact be the solutions because we don't have any effective way to bind the hands of the rulers that they haven't found an ingenious way to break the bonds. And if they break the bonds, there's no way to tame Leviathan. The only way to tame Leviathan is if you actually get bonds to tie their hands so they never break them. But if they can break them anytime they want, the only way that you can tame Leviathan is to have forces outside keep Leviathan in check. And that's its inability to have its money and its inability to claim monopoly or the way Weingast puts it, to have, say, economic regulation at the highest levels of government rather than at the lowest levels of government. We want to make sure we enhance competition, not protect governments from competition. So we want to get competitive government. That's the key issue. Get competitive governance, and free banking or taking money out of the system of the government's control. Otherwise, we're going to constantly be caught in this juggling trick that governments, as Smith pointed out, engage in, ancient as well as modern. Anyway, that's sort of my paper. I guess we have time for questions and whatnot. And so let's...
I'll let you take them.
You let me take them? Okay, so let's sort of open it up for questions. Yes, Kevin.
I'm always a little puzzled by these kind of discussions because they seem to come down to trying to think of a clever way to make government behave. In one case, you wanted to say not tie their hands, but take away their resources, take away their juggling pens. And your example of the juggling pen is the money, and wanting to say denationalize money. But we've of course lived through most of the history of the world.
Yeah.
With denationalized money, with commodity monies, where the amount of money in the world wasn't determined by the fiat of the government, but was determined by the amount of gold or silver that was in supply. And what's the history of that? Well, every time it runs up into a sufficiently important constraint, you simply change the rule. You go off of the whole history of commodity money since the Napoleonic Wars, and maybe before that, is a sequence of suspensions of the gold or silver standard constantly whenever you get into any kind of crisis. So the point there is, you can talk about taking away the juggling pins, but you can't really do it.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing actually is going to apply with
Fiscal policy.
Apply with your notion of competitive government. That, exactly the point where it becomes binding and hard. These people, it's not just the control over the money supply. They also have control over the military, the police, and all the things that it takes to change the rules. And put under enough pressure, the rules will change. So it doesn't seem to me like you really have a way of binding them.
Yeah.
In the route that you're following.
Okay, I take that criticism seriously. I think the way I would respond is we engage in comparative history in some level here, right? So let's just do the fiscal and governmental responses first. I agree with you that constitutions work when they pinch. And every time they pinch, people want to break the constitutions. So in fact, it's harder to break a constitution if you believe that constitutions are nothing more than focal points in a cooperative game. So like the way Bruce Ackerman describes an evolving constitution. So that's, and Russ Hardin actually makes this argument for constitutions. And I've always liked Buchanan's idea of a constitution better, precisely because it highlights this point that a constitution is supposed to be a contract. And a contract then binds us when in time t0, we agree to that constitution, but in time t1, we want to violate the constitution. But if we violate in time t1, we don't get to time t3 that we would like, so therefore it has this trade-off that we face, as opposed to the idea that the Constitution becomes whatever it is at that moment in time. But that's the way that most people think about a living Constitution, is that it evolves and reflects rather than binding us over time. And then there's other issues, I agree, philosophically, once we try to think of constitutions as contracts over a period of time about what binds. But the reality is that it does seem to me that at certain times in our history, U.S. history, we were actually able to have the Constitution somewhat binding, okay? And that there's something about the late 19th century and the beginning 20th century where Wilson is making the argument, strong argument, that we should no longer have this kind of checks and balances. Because the checks and balances, the way he put the puzzle was that checks and balances are necessary only when we don't want them. So it's another way to think about what you're talking about. So in good times, we never bump up to the Constitution because we're operating inside of its boundaries. But what happens is a crisis hits, and then we bump into that Constitution, and it's precisely in that crisis that we don't want the Constitution to discipline us, to bind us. So to the extent that checks and balances do anything like that, we don't want them to do it. To the extent we're operating inside of them, it's like the ceiling and me walking, it's not binding, right? And so therefore it's okay if I have it there, but if I was 12 feet tall, it wouldn't be, or higher, it wouldn't be good. So I think that what we need to do is make an argument again, a modern argument for why it is that we want these constraints. In the same way that Madison tried to make the argument about in Federalist 51. All right, and we have to make an argument like Madison made in Federalist 10 about the issue of factions and what's happened when we have the rule of factions and how that affects our democratic society. So if we believe that the churning state actually undermines our democracy, okay, then that's another argument for why it is we want to protect the churning state against the churning state. And so that would be another argument in modern times for restraints. So that's the way we're trying to think about through this. But I agree with you that war is the health of the state. And so even at the long end of Griva's book, and also at the end of a great book by Scott Gordon, you know, Scott Gordon's book, The Controlling the State, he gets all the way done with the efforts of controlling the state, and then he says, well, here's the one thing. Whenever military is involved, we've never found a way to stop them we just unleash everything and go. And so if that's the constraint that we bump up into, then we're, of course, we have to find other ways to do that. So I'm trying to, if you think about government as having to raise revenue in one of three ways, borrow, tax, and inflate. If I take away their ability to borrow and to inflate, I make their only ability to raise their revenues by taxes and then force competition on the taxes. The idea is that somehow will keep us better disciplined than if we say, hey, let's willy-nilly allow us to borrow, tax, and inflate. Does that make sense? I mean, you might not agree with it, but that's at least...
I get the idea.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm not sure that you can take that power away from them.
Yeah.
That when they go on, they'll take it back.
Yeah. John.
So let's see here. Goal and taming Leviathan. I understand how state competition for customers or citizens can sort of constrain what policymakers do in mutually beneficial ways. Case study of like California and Texas right now.
Yeah.
And the competing money supply, I think you just answered. My question was, why would that improve the situation? I guess it's by controlling inflation. Is that?
Yes, but also the idea of matching money supply and money demand. That like in a lot of markets, like matching the quantity demanded and quantity supplied of milk, we're able to say, hey, you know, we should do that through the market rather than through government fiat. It turns out, I think, that when you study certain relative free banking system. By the way, none of these things have existed, right? But if you look at the relative existence of them, they actually do a better job in some of the evidence that I've seen and sustain themselves against economic crisis. Like, for example, look at Canada during the Great Depression versus the US in the Great Depression in terms of their ability to be able to sustain economic downturn and actually generate, a sort of reasonable monetary system. So I think competition works better than we think. This goes back to another argument here about presuppositions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't know how Jeff will react to this, but I actually think the problem with all of us that are of a classical liberal bent, but think we can find constitutions that bind things, is that we're dealing with a problem of public predation and private predation. Public predation and private predation. We move to create constitutional regimes because we believe the threat of private predation to be real. Okay? And we're very, very pessimistic about our belief that private predation can be handled privately, but very optimistic that public predation can be handled publicly. Okay? But what if our presumptions are not quite right there? That actually it turns out that if we look at some evidence, let's say Ostrom's evidence, we can see that groups and individuals outside of government but can form governance institutions, so they can discipline private predation fairly effectively, and that our efforts at publicly constraining public predation have actually not been very effective. So we should be more pessimistic about public predation and more optimistic about private solutions to private predation, right? If that's true, then that changes slightly the balance of the way we think about things. But again, that's like a presupposition argument, right? It's like, what are the tacit presuppositions in political economy? Yeah.
Argument begs the question that you're always seeking ways to bind Leviathan and basically to break their bonds every time. To what degree do you consider McCloskey's argument on the bourgeois values and so forth as being the cause of how Leviathan was bound in the first place? If you look at the monarchy, for example, and how the rise of those values constrained the monarchy, and could a similar sort of intellectual revolution bind?
So, again, I'm going over territory that Jeff and Jim have dealt with, and sort of doing my own little twist on it, which means that sometimes it can. But here's the issue: is that if so, the way I would put this in economics is that the sort of moral fiber lowers or raises the enforcement costs of those regimes. So what happens is that if a free society works best when the need for a policeman or a preacher is least, that's because we've internalized those social norms, and so we don't cut in the line, we don't cheat we don't do those things, even when we're confronted with the opportunistic chance, right? We honor the contract, we do all that stuff. So, Hume has this great line where he says, look, the foundations of society are based on property, contract, and consent. We have to have, recognition of property, right? We have to have the keeping of promises, and we have to have transference by consent, right? And then that's the foundations of society. Whether we internalize those norms is going to determine how much of a binding institutional work needs to be done. And so Buchanan, at the end of his life, is arguing for the return of the soul of classical liberalism, so that to capture again his own notion of romance, because this is a guy who has destroyed romance, right? He's actually, destroyed it. And now he's saying, in order for us to get the kind of good society, which, by the way, he both said he never worried about, and at the same time, when he founds the Thomas Jefferson Center, he says that's what they're all about, discovering what the foundations of a good society are. I like that question, right? So, but he says, look, we need to somehow capture the romance again about this notion of a limited government and the kind of nature of opportunity and whatnot that could be created by a market society. And I think that admission is correct. And so I agree with you 100% on that. And so I think McCloskey's work is very, very valuable in getting us to rethink the sort of foundations of liberalism that are necessary for going forward with this kind of project. But anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.